We must transform our economic models. Renewable energy, sustainable supply chains and zero-waste policies are not optional. They must become the default option for both governments and businesses.
I'm Gavin Freeborn and welcome back to Original Ideas, a podcast from the University of Liverpool. In this series, we shine a light on the world of academic research, the impact it has on society and how it can shape our future. In this episode, we're looking at something that affects every single one of us, how we work, how organisations operate and how we can create sustainable business.
Economics are still important. Making a profit is still important. But we need to think about the impact beyond just the money. We need to think about the impact on society, on the natural resources.
According to a 2022 survey by Edelman Trust, 88% of investors put environmental, social and governance on par with financial considerations when making investment decisions. 60% of employees chose a place to work based on their beliefs and values, and 58% of consumers buy or advocate for brands who match their beliefs. Research from the University of Liverpool's Centre for Sustainable Business has helped steer local authorities and businesses as they look to build a sustainable framework for the future. I met with Professor Joanne Meehan to find out more. Thanks for joining me in the studio. Joe, it's great to meet you. Before we begin, let's get a brief overview of your background and research areas.
Yeah, so my background's actually in industry. So I spent 11 years working for ICI, a big chemical manufacturer, and I worked in buying in various procurement-related roles. And I left there to study a PhD. And one of the things I was interested in was corporate power and how buyers and sellers interact and how they negotiated. So my PhD was looking at power between organisations. And as the PhD progressed, and certainly as my career's progressed, I'm still interested in power, but I'm more interested now in the systems of power and systems of corporate power and how that plays a role in structural inequalities in our society, how it's played a role in environmental harms, and thinking about how we work as researchers to think differently around the role of business in tackling the climate emergency and social inequalities. So my work at the moment looks at modern slavery in corporate supply chains. It looks at how we can use public procurement as a lever to drive social value in our communities. And it's looking at what responsible business means. Not just doing less harm, but how we can actually do positive, restorative, economical impact.
Brilliant. So let's talk about the Centre for Sustainable Business within the Management School here at the University of Liverpool. What's the aim of the centre and what are your main goals?
So the centre was set up about 3 years ago, and it was set up because we realised we had all this brilliant research across the management school spanning all the different disciplines within management, whether that's supply chain, accounting and finance, economics, marketing, and there was no sort of home that brought them together. So we set the centre up to thread together our evidence that made it more accessible for businesses and for policymakers to interact with our evidence base. And we recognise there's a need to be urgent in our responses and to be ambitious in our responses. And businesses and policymakers are often nervous of taking that step forward because they don't want to take a wrong step. So we wanted to create the centre as a way to translate this evidence base for businesses in a much more accessible way for them to make better decisions.
So what are the main challenges for businesses and organisations? We've known about the importance of sustainable business for some time. Are there still common challenges that businesses face?
Yeah, there are common challenges, and those challenges are the same whether you're a small micro organisation or whether you're a corporate multinational. And I think many people talk about the cost of sustainability and the cost of doing responsible business. And potentially there may be a cost, but I almost think that's almost a bit of a lazy way of thinking about what the challenges are. We can always find resources to do the right thing. And often it doesn't cost us any more money anyway, because we often reduce some of our waste. So there's often a trade-off there in terms of cost. But for me, what I think is the challenge that all organisations face is that our system isn't really set up for economic and social benefit. And that prevailing system, that underpinning system, the way the economy works, is predicated on things like growth, profit, competition, and they're largely incompatible for the type of economic system we need if we're really serious about ambitious change towards environmental repair and really tackling structural social inequalities. So it's that deeper level that is the real challenge. It's that prevailing system. So our research in the centre is looking at how do we get to systemic change? And in academic terms, we call that institutional logics. What are the norms of behaviour? What are the rules of the game by which organisations are playing? And crucially, we're looking at, what are those norms and those rules? Who sets the rules and how do we change the rules? And that requires a collective effort across a range of stakeholders, businesses, policymakers, consumers, society. And it's a recognition that the economic system predicated on growth, logics, predicated on competition and profit doesn't serve us well. And businesses are not just vulnerable to harm, businesses cause harm. And that's a very uncomfortable space for businesses to be in. And we want to work in a way that gives organisations a community of like-minded businesses where together we can start to tackle that prevailing system by doing business differently.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So how does your research specifically help organisations and businesses with their sustainable goals?
It helps in a number of ways. For day-to-day operational decisions, it gives them an evidence base of things that work, things that don't work, and some of the reasons why that is. It also threads some of this evidence together. So businesses may be facing a challenge with, how do we reduce our Scope 3 emissions or how do we report our Scope 3 emissions? But that's not really the crux of the problem. That might be where they enter the challenge. But actually, that's got spin-out implications to how they conduct their marketing, how they think and map their supply chains, how they think about staff welfare, how they think about consumer engagement. So that spin-out impacts of this one decision are far-reaching. And what we're doing with our research is trying to thread that evidence base together to build a fuller, complete picture for businesses to say, if you press this little lever over here, these are the impacts it will have, and these are the things that we know will probably play out and what you might do about them.
So it's quite clear the challenges that we face as we drive this change in the future. But we should also celebrate the changes made so far. Have you seen businesses take on board insights and findings to change their own organisations?
We absolutely have. And we work with many organisations and policymakers. One of the examples is around our work on modern slavery in corporate supply chains. And we can see how those insights have started to take form and spread across an industry. So we've done lots of work looking at how businesses have responded to the new legislation around modern slavery. That evidence has been presented in the House of Lords by one of my colleagues, Dr. Bruce Pinnington. And we've been working particularly in the construction industry to show businesses, not that they're bad organisations, but to get them to care about workers beyond their scope of influence. So how do they even envisage the harms that may be created through their supply chains? And by using our research, looking at things like language that they use, look at how they make decisions, looking at how they frame paradoxical decisions in organisations, you can see organisations going, oh yeah, we do that too. And we don't want to carry on doing that. How can we do something different? So they use our evidence base as almost like this critical friend, as a challenge to their own behaviours. And that's started to have some industry collaborations, working with NGOs, working with other communities, working with victim advocates. And it's starting to slowly, but positively change the shape of some of those industries. So that's really rewarding when we see that happen. What we then need to do is to say, and what next? Not just say that that's the end of the story. Thinking about how do we take the learning from that into environmental harms? How do we take the learning from environmental harms into non-human harms? So it's finding these ways to grow our research impact through all these different networks we're trying to cultivate.
Brilliant. So if a business or potential business leader is listening to us now, the whole issue of building sustainable frameworks can seem quite overwhelming. Where do they start in steering their organisation for the future?
It's a good question, and I think they need to start by understanding where they are. And we encourage businesses, we run a programme called the Shaping Sustainable Futures programme, and in that programme we encourage businesses to sit with some uncomfortable thoughts for a while and to be curious about what else may come to pass. And in business, what we often find is the pressures of organisations mean we are always quickly searching for a solution. So tell me what works and I will implement it, move on to the next thing. And we almost need to slow down that thought process, because inevitably we will end up replicating harms somewhere else in that system, because the system itself doesn't necessarily work for planet or for people. So businesses need to be more comfortable in dealing with the uncomfortable. And what I would say to businesses is they need to really think about the harms that they create as businesses. And that's not a blame game, it's not a judgment, but it's an acceptance that things that we do cause harm, whether that's to people or to planet. And think about how those harms can not just be made less, but how can we eliminate them? How can we do business differently? So we have this strapline in the Centre for Sustainable Business about business not as usual. So how can we re-envisage how we do business? And that starts with how we think about true and fair. How our accounts are true and fair. Are they fully open? Do we disclose everything? Do we have transparency of our full supply chains? And very often we don't. And we need to think about the harms that we hold ourselves accountable for and who else can hold us to account. So as an example, we often see organisations put out their sustainability strategies and they'll have these nice big glossy reports saying, look at all this brilliant stuff we've done. And that's not to detract to say that's not brilliant stuff, but it often doesn't give the full story of harm. And that can have a counter effect of people can say, well, I'm actually experiencing harm as a result of these actions that you're taking, but my voice isn't being heard. And we want to open up the conversation where it is normalised that we talk about these uncomfortable truths. So the example I give is, I'm a football fan, Everton, in case you're wondering. We often report the goals we've scored, but we're less comfortable in reporting the goals we've conceded. But if we only reported the goals we've scored, that doesn't give us a true reflection at the end score, at the end of the game. So businesses need to start to think about the impacts they have on the world, and that means the extended impacts through their supply chain. So that first step is actually mapping their supply chains. Who is in our supply chains? Where are they in the world? How do we engage with that supply chain? And if businesses are saying, we can't possibly know who's in our supply chain, they're too big and complex, they need to recognise that that decision to make them big and complex was a decision that they took. And they can make different decisions to change the structure of that supply chain. But again, this goes hand in hand with that change to the prevailing system. If we don't change how we define success, if we're only going to look at growth, profit, etc., we're never really going to reward organisations that do different things. So instead, they may look at health, they may look at harms, they may look at engagement. How we shape those performance metrics matter because they change the decisions that we make.
Can you give us an example of an organisation that you've worked with who has a positive, sustainable business strategy?
A really interesting example is John Lewis Partnership. So I imagine most people understand John Lewis and what they do, retail organisation. And they came to speak at one of our events for the Centre for Sustainable Business. And what was really interesting about John Lewis was the way they think about profit. Profit isn't a dirty word. Organisations need to be profitable. They need to be profitable so they can pay workers good wages, so they can be resilient, so they can continue in what they do. But this tension between maximising profit and sustainability is problematic, because maximising profit implies this limitless growth, this finite growth, which we know is impossible and also incompatible with sustainability. But John Lewis do things quite differently. They talk about sufficiency. So they talk about making sufficient profit. So yes, they want to be profitable. Yes, they want to make money, but they don't want to maximise that at the expense of other things. So this idea of sufficiency is an important concept in sustainable business because it changes how organisations think about what they do. It changes the culture and it changes the purpose of profit. So what is the point of it? If profit is only to go to the owners of a business for them to accumulate this wealth, well, that's probably not got a great purpose. But if sufficient profit is used to have conversations around worker welfare, staff benefits, how we treat our suppliers, the types of businesses that we're involved in, that changes the whole culture and strategy of an organisation, because sufficiency becomes part of their performance, and its sufficiency as a concept has a clear purpose.
Brilliant, thank you. And from what I know, I think John Lewis are business that's been thriving since 1864, so they obviously have good form.
Exactly, so they've got a good heritage, we know it works. But this idea of sufficiency is starting to get some traction in other types of businesses. As businesses move to circular economy or they move to the sharing economy, it's not saying we can't have access to things, we can't have products and services, but we don't have to own everything. The sharing economy means we might rent or lease something. And it also encourages a much more collaborative approach. So if we were in the Liverpool City region, for example, how many bits of equipment do we need for certain tasks that we may do? How do we start to share resources between organisations? It means we're not producing stuff from new, but we're still getting access to the services we need. But it creates new forms of collaboration. It helps us to really think about the impact of those valuable resources and to treat them well and to maintain them.
Definitely. And having staff as partners in the business brings a whole new light to how they feel and how they do in their life, how they thrive.
Indeed. And we need to think about worker welfare as well as supplier welfare and workers through our supply chain. And how do we distribute that justice and distribute that value through our supply chain?
Yeah, that wealth. And I'm not an economist, but from what I know, Adam Smith's original idea of capitalism was meant to be that somebody could create a business, make money, and then the people who worked with them in that business would benefit from them making money. However, that doesn't seem to be how capitalism's worked out for
well, capital is about holding on to that capital.
Exactly.
We need to distribute. There's lots of money in the world. It's just all not finely distributed. It is concentrated in the hands of a few. And what we see in terms of markets, where there's market concentration, which we create through our actions as buyers and organisations, we buy from the same companies. Everybody's acting in the same way, because that's what our economic system tells us to do. It's about aggregation, it's about efficiency, it's about growth. We all end up buying from the same companies. We get huge amounts of market concentration. And what the evidence tells us about market concentration is that it is inexplicably linked with social inequality, because that wealth isn't distributed through an organisation and certainly not through its supply chain.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Professor Jo Meehan. It's been great to meet you and speak with you and hear about this very important topic. And we look forward to following your research and seeing how you continue to make a real world impact.
Thank you very much.
My name's Clare Wescott. I'm currently a final year PhD student in the Management School at the University of Liverpool. For me, a sustainable business is one that can survive into the future. It's not just about what people tend to think of as the green side of business. It is about how can business adapt and shift and change and still provide meaningful work, products, services, whatever people want in the future.
That's all we have time for in this episode of Original Ideas, looking at academic research around sustainable business and how it can help shape our organisations and ways of working for the future. If you've enjoyed listening, please do check out some of the other episodes. We've looked at how academic research is helping drive the AI revolution.
Technologies have been demonstrated to be highly effective, but need to make sure that there's some regulation.
Exploring popular music.
When they're screaming at Beatles concerts, they're not necessarily screaming at the Beatles. They're screaming because they have the freedom to do so.
And bringing the past to life in archaeology.
We can offer you stories of snapshots from the past that show how we perceive the past can be reshaped.
Head to liverpool.ac.uk/research, where you can also sign up to our monthly research newsletter with updates on events, opportunities to work with us, and much more. Follow and rate the Original Ideas podcast so you can get the latest episodes as soon as they're released. Thanks for listening. Talk to you again soon.